Welcome to the Debrief, Carolina Journal's weekly recap of major developments in North Carolina politics and public policy. I'm Mitch Kokai, sitting in this week for Donna King, and have a star-studded cast joining me of expert panelists. First of all, the deputy editor at Carolina Journal, Jeff Moore, is with us. And also joining us on the other couch, for the first time on the Debrief, we have John Hood, longtime commentator and syndicated columnist in North Carolina politics, and Joseph Harris, who is our fiscal policy expert at the John Locke Foundation. Lots of things to talk about. We're going to be talking quite a bit about what is happening preparing for 2025, since the year is winding down. But first, a couple of major developments still lingering on from North Carolina's politics and public policy as we wind down 2024. One of them, the one major outstanding North Carolina election, and that is for a seat on North Carolina's Supreme Court. As things stand, the appointed incumbent Democrat, Allison Riggs, looks like the winner in this race by just 734 votes over Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin, who is a judge on the Court of Appeals. But the development this week is that Griffin filed a nearly 4,000-page document with the state Supreme Court asking the court to step in and issue an order called a writ of prohibition that would block the State Board of Elections from counting some votes that Griffin has challenged. 60,000 ballots, perhaps, that could be affected by this ruling. This is something that's really been stretching this election well beyond what anyone expected. Jeff, this is something that we haven't really seen that much in North Carolina politics.
Yeah, well, we've seen close Supreme Court races, but usually they're getting resolved around this time before Christmas. And we obviously with the Chief Justice Newby versus Beasley in that race there, it came down to about 400 votes. So we've had some of these close races. This was not exactly the one I thought would be looking before the election that would really come down to the wire. But you see them, from a political perspective, exhausting every single option they have. I think from the North Carolina Republican Party's perspective of satisfying their constituency to really push as much in the way of election integrity and making sure that the votes are counted appropriately according to the law, they're exhausting that last option. This seems to be the last one. It's the biggest one, judging by the number of pages in that filing, and we'll see how it shakes out, but it may not shake out in Griffin's favor after all, but we'll have to see what the court says and if they get involved, which is going to be a whole nother can of worms politically.
John, you've been monitoring North Carolina politics for decades now. You'll remember
that's a nice way of saying I'm old.
You and I both. But you remember back at a time when the General Assembly ended up electing someone to the Council of State because of an unresolved election. This seems to be like another one of these cases where it's been going on probably longer than not only would people have expected, but probably than it should have.
That's right. We've had these events in the past. Commissioner of Agriculture, for example, it was a couple of decades ago that we had a disputed election. Of course, judicial elections, the legislature can't settle those by law, so that is something that has to go to the court. I think the challenge that Jefferson Griffin and the Republicans have here, they have an argument. Most of these ballots have to do with a law that requires that voter registrations include identification numbers, either related to Social Security or driver's license numbers. There are a number of registered voters who do not have that in their file. The problem, the remedy, is not necessarily fit the offense, you might say, because most of these people seem to have registered years ago. They registered having no idea that there was something missing. The law was passed after they were registered. And so going back in and saying after the fact, people who had to present, for example, photo IDs to establish their identity, then still their ballots don't count because of noncompliance. You can understand that there really is a noncompliance problem, but the remedy of not counting ballots after the election, that's going to be, I think, a hard thing for Griffin and to win in the court. Well, I guess we'll have to see.
And another piece of this is getting the state Supreme Court involved in a race that affects a seat on the state Supreme Court, including one of their colleagues.
That's odd. It's awkward. It is ultimately inevitable. If there was some more obvious electoral misconduct that really there's a clear justification for the Supreme Court to intervene, they would have to in a Supreme Court race, because I'm not sure there's any other body that has the power to do that. It is awkward, but I think it's legally required if there was a legitimate need to do something about this election.
but it's certainly going to be something to watch. Stay tuned to CarolinaJournal.com for all of the updates on this case as it moves forward. I'm going to move now to Joseph because we're going to talk about one other issue that's still lingering as 2024 winds down before we look ahead to what happens in 2025, and that is the potential for Congress to do something about disaster relief, including here in North Carolina with the recovery from Helene. You've been watching this very closely, and a deal that had been struck but then kind of fell apart had a major amount of money that would be going toward disaster relief. How might that have affected North Carolina?
So Tuesday evening, the U.S. House released a Disaster Recovery Act that was 1,547 pages, so it was quite large, but it wasn't just a Disaster Recovery Act, it was also a continuing resolution for the federal government to essentially stay open. And in addition to that, it also included quite a bit of health policy. It also included what would be the first increase in salary for members of Congress since 2009. But there was $110 billion worth of disaster recovery in it, and it would have been divided up between North Carolina and multiple other states that have been affected this year by disasters. It did not go into detail about how much for each state, but it allocated money to multiple federal agencies. For example, there would have been $31 billion to the United States Department of Agriculture, $29 billion for FEMA, $12 billion for HUD, and $8 billion for the Department of Transportation. And on Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning, it looked like this had some momentum, but by Wednesday night, as you mentioned, it basically became clear that this was not going to be passed. There's quite a few policymakers who are interested in just a specific disaster recovery bill, not with all the other things attached. But we would have had a pretty good chance of getting a decent chunk of that $110 billion from multiple different agencies.
And as we speak, this is all unresolved, but by the time that you watch this or at the end of the week, there might be some sort of resolution because this is all tied to the potential for a limited government shutdown. John, we've seen this type of thing crop up with Congress time and again. Things come to the end of the year or toward the end of a debt limit or the end of a continuing resolution, and you see lots of things lumped together in one bill, some of which make sense, some of which don't.
It's not exactly a paragon of civic virtue. I mean, we got to figure out a better way to do federal budget. And in fact, North Carolina did. North Carolina, years ago, the legislature passed a bill that basically makes it impossible for there to be a government shutdown. If you don't pass a new budget, then the agencies just continue using the previously budgeted amounts. We need something like that at the federal level, I suspect, though you still have to tie it to a debt limit, which I don't think we want to get rid of that either. But we need to figure out some way out of this because not going through regular order, not passing appropriations bills through the relevant committees and fashioning a budget and following the general procedure, which in North Carolina is usually what happens, in most states is usually what happens. It never happens in Washington, and we end up with outcomes that really please nobody. You have little bits and pieces in there to buy this vote and that vote and make this headline and please that podcast host, and as a whole, it's just embarrassing.
Jeff, Carolina Journal has done quite a bit in covering what members of the congressional delegation are looking at in terms of Helene. I'm sure that whatever happens, the folks who are out there in Western North Carolina and our senators will be making sure that North Carolina gets some of that pie.
Yeah, I believe even with the blow up of this continuing resolution, you've seen influence from the president-elect coming in already and helping to kill that bill, but has re-emphasized that the disaster relief should be part of a quote-unquote clean CR that comes up in its place. So like you said, by the time this airs or later this week, we may have a different version of this that I believe is all but certain to have the disaster relief portion of this. Is probably other areas that were tucked into that policy-wise that they were unwilling to really go forward with. So I think that Western North Carolina's interests are going to be covered by this. You have President Trump very much interested in making sure that people in that part of the state and other disaster-affected areas around the country are taken care of going forward. And so we'll see how that shakes out before Christmas. I bet we have something to speak about before Santa Claus gets here.
Well, much of the rest of the news that we have seen taking place in North Carolina politics and public policy in recent week has been looking ahead to 2025. We know that Josh Stein, the incoming governor, has already been making some cabinet appointments. We know that Tim Moore, outgoing Speaker of the North Carolina House, who's moving to Congress, knows his first major committee assignment. So we're going to devote the rest of this program also to what's happening in terms of the world of 2025 and looking ahead. And we're going to go back toward Helene, and I'm going to start with Joseph because you've been watching the various packages that North Carolina has already addressed dealing with Helene. This is likely to be a big issue again for the General Assembly in 2025, what to do money-wise about Helene.
Yes. So far, policymakers in North Carolina have passed 3 disaster recovery acts for Helene, totaling about $1.1 billion. In addition to that, we have put out a request. Governor Cooper and the state have put out a request for about $25 billion from the federal government. Also worth noting is that initially the financial impact was estimated to be $53 billion. Just last week, that was updated to $59 billion. So about a 10% increase since the initial estimate. Quite a few policymakers are heavily motivated to get this federal funding, but then what's important is who is going to administer these funds once we get these funds. And previously, that was NCOR, that was the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Unfortunately, they generated about a $300 million budget deficit, and they only completed about 68% of the homes they were supposed to help repair for Hurricanes Matthew and Florence.
From years ago.
From years ago. So there's still about 1,300 families from Matthew and Florence that are waiting for their homes to be repaired currently. Destin Hall, who is expected to become the new Speaker of the House, he appears to be highly motivated to make changes. He seems like he does not want NCOR to continue with Helene. He's even went as far to saying that this should be a national scandal and that he's surprised that it's not. And he's also mentioned that he has had conversations with Governor-elect Stein, and Stein has communicated that he is willing to consider other options for administering this disaster recovery. Specifically, when we get this money from HUD, it's going to be multiple billions of dollars. And this money is supposed to go to help the families and help them get back in their homes. And we are looking for new alternatives other than NCOR for administering these funds.
Turning back to Jeff, we know that Carolina Journal has spent a lot of time focusing on NCOR and whether it's getting things right in any way or if it's just sort of throwing good money after bad. I expect that the General Assembly is going to be putting a much tighter eye on what happens with Helene relief now.
Yeah, I mean, they've been burned several times now through several hurricanes, actually, in the eastern part of the state, which is a little bit more usual, but now the western part of the state. And with incoming Speaker-elect Hall from the western part of the state, teaming up with Representative John Bell, the incoming Rules Chairman from the eastern part of the state that's still dealing with the effects of Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, you're likely to see them intolerant of not sharing some oversight of where these funds are going. With a new administration in the governor's office, you may actually see something shake loose in the way of more cooperation to make sure that, at the very least, like politically speaking, that they don't take the PR hit that you get from these things dragging on and on and on, but from a real human sense, that you actually affect some positive change for the people that have been affected so mightily. We've got winter weather in the western part of the state that's affecting a lot of people that have lost homes and everything. So you've got maybe the most intense motivation you could possibly have to get something to actually filter through. And as we've seen with the other disaster recovery funds that come through and then they trickle out, no one, I think, is in a space to really tolerate that for much longer. So you'll see oversight on the legislative side from the General Assembly to make sure that these things get to where they need to be.
John, how much do you see Helene driving what the General Assembly does in the new year?
I think it'll be a huge part of what the legislature tackles in 2025 and beyond, and also what the new Josh Stein administration does. They understand that the previous administration, with which there's a lot of continuity. I mean, there are some new faces with Stein's camp and his cabinet, and also some people from Cooper's cabinet. But this is one of the things about Cooper's administration that no one will look back with any level of fondness or appreciation for, is the management of these emergency funds. One of the matters, there's multiple problems, I gather, but one of the challenges they faced that the most recent legislation the General Assembly passed about Helene started to tackle was a regulatory problem. that if you've got damaged homes, you've got to either fix them or replace them. You've got to think about how quickly you can do that versus the regulations that are imposed on new construction. When it comes right down to it, you've got to act faster. And if that means loosening some of those rules and letting some houses be rebuilt or refurbished that aren't meeting current codes, or even building new housing in a more cost-effective manner, we're going to have to do it, because people aren't going to stand the level of disaster in the West. It's such a scale. People aren't just going to stand for another replay of the Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Florence problem.
Certainly an issue that we know Carolina Journal and the Debrief will be focusing on quite a bit in the coming year. One thing that always drives the train for the legislative session each year, year in and year out, is the budget. We know this is not unrelated to Helene, because Helene's going to have an impact, but the budget debate will be a big piece of it. And Jeff, I'll start with you. We know that one of the things that Carolina Journal will be doing is monitoring what's going on with the budget. You in particular have been monitoring a piece of the last budget that caused some controversy, and that is this whole NC Innovation program. What do you expect, if anything, on NC Innovation in 2025?
From the budgeting side of things, I'm not sure that they get to a space where they are in a good enough position to ask for more funds. Originally they asked for $1.2 billion. They said that was the least amount that they could take to do it. And they did not get that lobbying win, but they did get 2 installments of $250 million, so $500 million. They're just now getting to a point where they're picking an investment manager to manage that endowment. And so at some point they'll have returns from that endowment coming in, and allocating those to grantees, evaluating more opportunities for grants. And so they're going to be in the middle of that kind of proof of concept stage for that entity. So I don't know that they will have the leverage to lobby heavily for additional funds in that budget, considering some of the problems they've had with some transparency, accounting issues. They've had a board of directors there that questioned exactly if they were following some of the mandates that are in the legislation. But I think you will have some oversight. You have an Oversight and Reform Committee in the House that's looked at it. They interviewed the CEO this last session. I imagine they'll have them come back and speak more about where these taxpayer funds are invested, how much risk they're being exposed to, and whether or not the concept itself is going to bear out. Now, that's something that may take a lot of time. Obviously, with some of the research projects and funding mechanisms, they don't just appear and come to fruition overnight. So the executives involved with NC Innovation have said that this is more of a 7 or 8 year time scale, but that in 50 years we'll be very glad that we did this, which is is something that a lot of very big thinkers with big visions tend to work towards when they're working with taxpayer money, that 50 years down the road we'll be glad that we did this. But I don't think that in this next 12 months they'll be in a good position or a strong position to be asking for more funds. I think now they're in the proving stage.
And if it doesn't work out, none of them will be around to blame at that point. Joseph, you're going to be spending a lot of your time on the budget as part of your role being the fiscal guy at the John Locke Foundation. I know one thing that you will be focusing on is the money that we don't really see as part of the main general fund budget. We've seen a trend of much more spending outside of that. Are you going to be keeping an eye on that again in 2025?
Yes. So we have what is called the general fund net appropriations. In this past budget, that was about $31.6 billion. And whenever you see the newspaper and you see the North Carolina budget, that's the number you're looking at, okay? And essentially, what are these net appropriations composed of? Well, the easiest way to think about it, this represents all the money the state is spending that came from tax dollars that were generated within the state, okay? Well, in addition to these the general fund net appropriations, there's also reserve accounts, and there used to just be a few reserve accounts. However, now there's more than 30 different reserve accounts. Quite a few of them have nothing in it, and they've never had anything in it, but there's several of them. But what's interesting about these reserves, when they put money into these reserves, they do not show up in the general fund net appropriations, so you never see them in the headline. Well, in the past 3 years, we have allocated over $16 billion in the past 3 fiscal years to these reserve accounts. So that essentially represents $16 billion of government spending that we're really not talking about that much. And some of it
not counting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, and some of it makes complete sense, like our savings reserve that we are currently using now to help the victims of Hurricane Helene. However, some of these reserves aren't really reserves. There's what's called the Regional Economic Development Reserve. A couple of years ago, we put $1.2 billion in this reserve. However, we immediately spent it. So it's not as if we're actually putting it in a reserve. We're putting it in the reserve momentarily so it doesn't show up in the net appropriations, but then we're immediately spending it. And for the Regional Economic Development Reserve's case, it's all local projects. It's projects that policymakers want for their local area that would be kind of frowned upon to pass. So it's kind of a pork fund. So I'll be very interested in the big budget number. How much larger is it going to be than 31.6, but also how many billions are they going to be also shuffling over into these reserve accounts?
Yeah, one might call it a slush fund,
Yes.
and similar things have been called slush funds in the past. John, what are you going to be watching for with the budget?
Well, the basic numbers look like through November, through the first 5 months of the fiscal year, general fund revenue, total tax and non-tax revenue, is up about 2%. That's okay, it's not stellar. Spending is up 12%. But that's because of the hurricane thing. So the point he was making is something like a savings reserve, you put the money in, that isn't spending and it shouldn't be counted as spending. When you pull it out, it should be counted as spending and is. The problem with a lot of these reserve accounts is it's not counted on either end. They put the money in the reserve and that's not spending, and then it gets spent and it's also not spending. That is a transparency problem. We are misinforming taxpayers about literally how big the state budget is by putting some of these money in what are not really truly like savings reserves, but just alternative ways to route money outside of the general fund.
Well, we certainly know that the John Locke Foundation, Carolina Journal, and John Hood in your syndicated column will be keeping track of all of these things. Want to save time at the end of the show for something that's a little bit off the topic, but I want to hit very briefly one more thing about 2025, and that is some new faces. We've already referenced them. A new governor, Josh Stein, a new Speaker of the House, likely to be Destin Hall. That vote takes place once the House comes back into session. Phil Berger's still in charge over the Senate side, but there'll be some other new faces. I just very briefly want to talk to John and to Jeff about what do you expect out of these new faces? Josh Stein, Destin Hall, how is this going to change things, if at all?
Well, it is true that Josh Stein is similar to Roy Cooper in some ways and actually worked for Cooper at one point, and both had previously served in the state Senate. But Cooper had served in the state Senate in the 90s and didn't really have that many pre-existing relationships with the existing legislature when he became governor in 2017, whereas Josh Stein served with some of these Republican senators not that long ago. So he starts out with a little bit more of a relationship. We'll see if that develops into anything. I mentioned earlier the cabinet choices and other kinds of top aide choices. Stein has brought in a fair number of new faces, but there's also some continuity in positions like the budget director, Department of Public Safety. One of the new faces, Dr. Songvai, who is a hospital administrator with the Duke Health System. He's going to be the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. Gabriel Esparza, who had run for state treasurer as a Democrat in the most recent election cycle, is going to be head of the Department of Administration. These are new faces into the state government, into the high-level cabinet jobs, but faces that seem to be pretty well qualified for their roles.
Jeff, Destin Hall now leading the Speaker's job after having been the Rules Chairman. Do we expect much change in the House?
Yeah, in the House, as far as the operation goes, he served as the rule chairman, served under the leadership of Speaker Moore, so there's going to be a lot of continuity on that side as well, but you're going to have a little bit of different attitude and approach to the leadership. He's a younger speaker, may bring some kind of generationally different kind of approaches to things in that respect. But also I think as we work our way through this session, what we'll be talking about most is not necessarily the changes in new leadership, but the things that have stayed the same. With Berger staying there in the Senate and the leadership there, his relationship with Stein, as you mentioned, having served in the Senate previously, I think that what will really drive the news cycles are going to be the battles driven by the leadership of Berger over in the Senate, and the leadership in the House is going to maybe fall back to some of the more controversial things that are likely to emanate from the tension between whatever tension may come from between the General Assembly and the governor's office. And Berger, as as the long-serving leader over there, is likely to serve as the main foil in the eyes of Josh Stein's administration, and especially with the people directing news coverage in Raleigh especially. They're going to focus on the power seat that Berger has in the Senate there, and the conflicts that will come with the other branches.
Well, it's going to be an interesting 2025. But we are still in the closing days of 2024. We're in the holiday season, and it's still a chance. You have a few more days to buy some Christmas gifts. One of them that you might like, if you are interested in books of a certain type, is the latest novel from our panelist, John Hood. This is the third book in your folklore cycle, Waterfolk. Tell us a little bit about what this is all about.
Well, these are books of a certain type, where you've got Daniel Boone and George Washington and congressional debates and sea monsters, that kind of book. You've seen those all the time. So Folklore Cycle is my series of novelettes and novels and short stories set in in America of the 17 and 1800s, but has some epic fantasy thrown in. Part of the idea is just to be entertaining. I've been writing a newspaper column for almost 40 years. I've written 7 nonfiction books, but all my critics said I was just writing fiction. So I figured, well, maybe I should try that. Maybe if I officially write fiction, they'll call it nonfiction. I don't know. But part of the idea is to foster an appreciation of American history, which I have a passion for, and I think we need more knowledge about. And part of it is to explore some themes about American identity and nationhood, the role that faith, the role that belief, the role that principles play in American history. And so that's what I do with these stories. The fact that there's a odd dwarf or elf or something fighting a monster in the Mississippi River, that just goes with the territory.
So in this latest book, what are some of the events or places that people will see?
Waterfolk depicts America from the 1830s to the 1850s. So there's a lot of focus on westward expansion and the exchange and interaction that happened with Native American cultures. The abolitionist movement, as it grows and develops, is depicted in the book. And such events as the Texas War of Independence, the Alamo, which I depict in a pretty long and exciting chapter, the Mexican-American War, which helped to define, along with treaties with Britain, what became the 48 states, the continental U.S. This was a time when the United States entered into its own, became a major player, really, not just in the Americas, but beyond, and took the shape that more or less it still has. So I think this antebellum period is very important, helps us understand, of course, the onset of the Civil War, what were the factions and trends, slavery and other things that led to the Civil War. That's what I explore in the book, with a few magic spells.
Does your favorite president, James K. Polk, make an appearance?
He is referenced, but he is not a character. I had to resist every temptation to make him a character, but Andrew Jackson is a character. There are a number of other presidents that actually show up in the book.
All right. Well, it is Waterfolk, part of the Folklore Cycle. Probably the easiest way to get more information about it is to go to that website, folklorecycle.com.
You got it.
All right. And that's all the time that we have for this edition of the Debrief. You'll want to join us next week for the last edition of the year. Donna King will be back in the host seat, and she's going to have another special guest for you. But that's all the time that we have this week. Thanks for joining.